Okay, thanks so much. And this is one thing that I often share when we talk about why are we doing these conversations or why are we having these conversations to begin with. I I came up with this writing a long time ago when I started doing this work, and it says healing oneself from colonial harm is liberating. Healing from colonial harm with your community is revolutionary. And I often just share this piece because we all are probably familiar with how we decolonize, meaning unpack the ways in which we've been colonized and unlearn all of those, right? And that in itself is a healing process. So healing from all of these painful experiences of trauma, from colonialization, from colonialism, and even how our families have embodied colonialism. There's a lot to unpack there, and we're all healing. Being in this space is part of that healing journey. But sharing this healing journey with your family members who have also experienced them, sharing this healing journey with other community members in the Filipino community who continues to experience anti-Filipino racism, to be able to heal together and again understand our roles in healing and then fighting those oppressive forces that have led us to be traumatized, to be pained to begin with. That is a revolutionary act. That is an act of resisting against those same oppressive forces, against racism, right? Against the oppression of our people. So aside from the healing aspect and personal, interpersonal aspect of it all, I hope you all can encapsulate the gravity of being in this space and engaging in these conversations after with your people. All right. We're going to go through some strategies that I'd love to share. And if any of them resonate with you, if you have any comments or questions about them, feel free to jump in anytime. The first part of those strategies will focus on what will happen when you actually start having conversations with family members. So these are in the moment, one-on-one or maybe small group discussions. Okay. I also want to mention that we're going to be sharing some dialogues and responses or scripts throughout the session. And I often just love sharing that to give people some ideas. But I also want to recognize that they won't probably apply to all of us or to our relationships with our families and communities, but hopefully they're a good starting point for many of us. Okay. When having these types of racial dialogues with family members, especially those who are resistant to these types of dialogues to begin with, it's important to start by establishing and engaging with transparency. So that means establishing humble and clear intentions, letting your family members know why this type of conversations mean to them, or why are you even bringing up these conversations to begin with. You can explain that your goal is to not criticize or attack them. I think it's very important to really recognize, because we often get defensive, right? When this types of conversations come up. I'm not just talking about people who are resistant. Even for me, sometimes people who've been doing this work for a long time, I still feel that there's a sense of defensiveness in me. Right. So it's important to mention that you're not here to criticize or attack them, but to educate together and learn together. You can also share how much it means to you to have these discussions, and that you see them and your family members as someone who you can be allies with, or your family members who you can do this journey with, who you can learn with. And this helps sort of set a foundation of respect and understanding as early as possible in the conversation, especially when you open it up with grace. Choosing our words with care, right? A lot of the dialogues you see here are, there's what we call a calling in versus calling out process that became popularized in DEI and racial justice conversations. So calling in is sort of an invitation to have a conversation, private or a small group conversation, to bring attention to an individual or person or a group's harmful behavior in a way that is more open and gracious and not centered in judgment. Whereas calling out is a bit more shaming, or it can also involve some blame in the process, letting them know why directly how bad of a person they are. Oftentimes calling out is very much centered in that culture, and in a way cancel culture as well. So we are leaning more into the calling in process as a way of recommendation when engaging in this space. So you can use dialogues like, why do you think that? If someone says something problematic, you can unpack it further by asking, why do you think that? I want to understand. Can you explain it a little bit more? Would you like to share the resources in which you got this information from? Or even ask, perhaps this video can help explain my point. Right? You'll notice a lot of these dialogues, these quotes as well. They further unpack people's thought process and create more digestible dialogues, right? So focusing on more on where did people get the information from? So you can check, is this a misinformation? Is this disinformation? Is there anything that is not right with this? Or even asking for them to elaborate so that you can understand it better, or asking why do they think that, looking through their thought process. It gives you an opportunity to talk about smaller topics instead of like a much larger and vague conversation that is already uncomfortable, that already people are not always ready with. Normalizing mistakes. A very, very crucial, important tip that I often share with people. Normalizing mistakes is really important because this kind of honesty shows our family members, our circles in a community, that we all have room to grow, even for us who are trying to engage other people in this conversation. Racial justice, racial equity work is huge. And honestly, even for myself, who has been in this practice for over a decade, there is no way that I can know everything there is to know about racial justice, racial equity, about different racialized communities and their lived realities. So I am bound to make mistakes. I am bound to also not understand certain things. I'm bound to learn more things in this journey. So it's important, especially when engaging family members who are not open or who may be resistant to these types of conversation, to be honest and transparent to them. Let them know that this will not be a perfect conversation. You are not perfect to begin with, and that you're asking from them is to be in this learning journey with you. Creating a safer space. Okay, and we talk about safer space, and you often might hear it as safe space as well. I call it safer space because ultimately we cannot create a space that is safe for everyone. There are just bound to be triggers or pieces of information that may harm people that are out of our control. So I strive specifically to create safer spaces as much as I can. So there are some important pieces here, that tips and pieces that guides us through creating a safer space, including prioritizing a familiar and comfortable environment, whether that be choosing a space where everyone feels relaxed and can freely express themselves, whether that be at home, in the comfort of your homes. You can also offer food and drinks or different ways of comfort to facilitate these types of conversations. As I mentioned, a relaxed atmosphere often sort of breaks down guards for people, right? Bring that comfort, especially if the conversation is not going to be comfortable, that it's not going to be comfortable for other people. You can bring that sense of comfort in many different ways. You can also encourage questions and follow-up. Use clear and simple language that does not overwhelm people, that does not bring them more discomfort, that they do not know what it means. Or even if there are language that you really have to use, jargon that you really have to use, you can explain them, of course, not in a demeaning way, but explain them in a way that just often naturally flows in the conversation. I really love using media, different types of mediums and media, to facilitate conversations with families. So oftentimes, if we are to watch a movie and I am in charge of choosing a movie, I'd often choose a movie that already has this sort of underlying conversations about racial dialogues or even themes about racial justice. Also recommending some videos to my family. Group chats are a big thing these days, family group chat. So I'd be that pesky person who sends out, critical or like really videos, YouTube videos that talks about racial justice, or even reels that talks about racial justice. It also allows me to give people digestible information and give them that avenue for understanding. Okay, I'm gonna go through this. This is very quick, and then I'm gonna pause to give folks some time to digest and give folks some opportunity to ask questions. But it's also very important to understand their emotions for us as people who are trying to engage others in these conversations. So really being in tune with their emotions, and I know it can sometimes be hard in a world that taught us that we need to be fast, that we need to be quick all the time, that we need to be autopiloted. But when it comes to having these conversations, I really find it helpful to be in tune with my emotions, and one, acknowledging what are my comforts and discomforts. Reflecting on what it means for me to be uncomfortable in these types of conversations. And I'll share a sort of a diagram later on that will unpack this further. But the second piece of acknowledgement and reflection that I encourage folks to think about is acknowledging our privileges, right? Reflecting on our own biases and privileges is important because it really opens door for honest dialogue, right? Privileges refers to unearned advantages that benefit certain groups based on their gender, racial status, social status, race, financial status, and other factors, or even the fact that you are employed, that is a privilege in itself, right? So these types of privileges will allow you to be more transparent, like what we talked about earlier, be more transparent and understand further and help articulate further why you are having these conversations to begin with, and that you are using your privileges to have these conversations. There's also acknowledging our triggers. And when you started answering those questions earlier about your childhood, unpacking your childhood experiences with racial dialogues, I encourage you all to look back. Are there any triggers in there? Did you feel anything triggering? And then start to already map that out. If that were to come out in these conversations that I'm about to have with my family members around racial dialogues, how does it show up for myself, right? For example, I know when I'm getting triggered, I start fidgeting, right? I start to be mindful of what I do with my body. I start fidgeting, my legs start to stomp and shake a little bit. And then with the recognition of those physical manifestations of my triggers, I then know how to sort of, okay, bring myself back and then sort of think to my head, okay, why am I being triggered by this? Is this the right time to have these types of conversations? Am I ready for these types of conversations? Okay. And so this is like the dialogue that I was talking about. Okay, the 3 zones, which is very much a work from the Brigham and Women's Hospital. They also do a lot of racial justice resource work. And this is a really good one that came out of their resources and their website. The 3 zones talks about the different levels of feelings and emotions that you may go through when engaging in uncomfortable conversations, including racial dialogues. Right. So again, like I mentioned earlier, understanding what are your comforts and what are your discomforts. For example, for me, I'm very comfortable having these types of conversation, regardless of who I'm with. But there are conversations where when it comes to I'm not fully sure about topics that I'm not fully sure about, or I am not as well versed in, I start to feel like, oh, I don't know if I have a lot to talk about in here. So there's some sense of discomfort there, which leads to the learning part, right? The learning part where there are parts of learning where I start to question myself, even if like, I'm learning this, okay, this is new information, I'm starting to process it. But also I'm starting to feel some sense of discomfort because I do not know this information before. Should have I known it, or maybe I could have done a better job at understanding it. Right. So my learning can sometimes bear through sense of panic, even, especially I start being uncomfortable when I start realizing that I do not know what a topic is, and I'm afraid that I may say something bad or I may say something inappropriate. Right. So I encourage you all to think about your comfort, learning, and panic zones when having these types of conversations, because again, it's important to be in tune with our emotions, because with our emotions and the physical manifestations of our emotions, we start to track and really understand how we're reacting to things, not just understand how other people that we're trying to engage in these conversations with are reacting to things. Okay. I'm going to pause there. Do folks have any questions so far? Anything that makes sense or anything that doesn't make sense? Okay. If folks are good, we're going to move on to, actually, well, let's do this one first. It's bound to happen that things may get heated. Many of you all know that navigating conversations about race can sometimes lead to disagreements or strong emotions. So here are some dialogues that would help manage these types of conversations. Again, I'm going to be sharing many of these dialogues that we're sharing here now in our post emails, so don't worry about taking photos or taking notes. There's quotes here that says, I understand this is a very uncomfortable conversation to engage in. So bringing up the fact that it may be an uncomfortable conversation, sort of bringing the elephant in the room, may help sort of trigger, lower down people's triggers. It's also important to acknowledge discomfort and propose revisiting the conversations later, right? It's important to recognize when to pause and step away, because oftentimes when yelling or a heated argument starts happening, that is really a signal that, okay, this conversation shouldn't be happening at all, because either one person or two people are not ready at this time, right? And yeah, take a break if needed, especially when things get heated. And then you can always mention that, okay, this is not the right time to have this conversation. We can do this again next time when we're both calmer. You can also reassure that what you want to come out of this conversation are discussions and dialogues and not fights. Again, even just mentioning the fact that I don't want to fight, I just want to understand where our indifference is coming from, can hopefully, again, help calm down triggers. Okay. And then it's important to recognize, you already mentioned this earlier, but it's important to recognize that there is no perfect conversation. One, because we are not entirely experts in all of this. Sometimes many of these conversations that we're going to be having are lived experience, not our own. So we may be bound to make mistakes. Others who are not ready may bound to make mistakes, but it's important to just have the conversations, even if they're not perfect, because the more you do these types of conversations, the more we engage in them, the more we feel comfortable, the more our comfort zone grows. Right? And the more we can understand how to have these conversations with specific people and specific members of our families and circles. And with that, the last part before we start sort of diving into some narratives is doing the work in the long run. So we've talked about how to engage in these conversations when they're actually happening. What are some scripts or dialogues that we can use? Now, it's important to emphasize that having these conversations, the work doesn't just stop when you have those conversations or in the space itself, but it continues after, or it continues before you even have these conversations, and the overall work that we commit into racial justice. So for that, I really want to offer the lens of outside of these conversations, and to help nurture these conversations in the future, these dialogues in the future, it's important that we understand the oppression, and understanding oppression in the lens of our parents and family members, especially those who are resistant to having racial dialogues, right? One thing that really is my motivator as I was engaging in immigrant work, immigration and migration work with Filipino families, is for me to really understand what my mother has gone through as a temporary foreign worker, as someone who didn't have permanent residency or citizenship status at some point, as someone who was separated from her family for the longest time, right? Because that's a whole system of oppression that I at once didn't know how it worked and how it impacted my family and my mom in a personal level. So understanding what that looked like for your Filipino parents, for your Filipino family members, what are those worlds of oppression they're in, can really help you, one, contextualize where they're coming from, and two, it can also help you understand how to have these conversations with them and have those case studies and comparisons that you can bring up, right? I will share some of those examples later on. But when I truly understood what my mom went through as a temporary foreign worker, it really helped me give her some better examples of how to engage in these conversations or how to bring her to care about racial justice issues, because I get to connect that world of oppression for her to the oppression of that of other communities. Healing relationships, building trust. It's important to mention this. I talked about healing together as family, as a unit, as community earlier, but it's integral in doing this work because, for example, I noticed when I was engaging more of this healing work with my family, engaging my family in this healing work, not just for myself. I would bring them to Filipino events with me, Filipino events that I like engaging with, such as anti-racism events, right? I would bring my mom to my speaking gigs when I would talk about these very topics, or I would send her like content that I create in racial justice. Right? When I start to bring her in my world and start to bring her in spaces that I find healing, I realized that she also started learning a lot more about why this matters to me. And she started realizing, she started really actually learning a lot from what I do and what I put out in this world. Um, there's this running joke in many Filipino communities where our parents don't know what we do for a living. And I started realizing that her actually starting to figure out and understand what I do for a living is kind of healing, not only for me, but for our relationship with each other. Because it brings us to a point where we have that common understanding of especially when engaging in spaces like this, we have that common understanding of why we respond the way we are. I also want to mention that if trust is lacking with specific family members, consider seeking out other family members or individuals in your community who can perhaps guide these discussions or bring understanding and changing, and bring understanding and bring that mindset, a neutral mindset into the space. Social media and media platforms our families engage in. I've already mentioned about sharing content from my social media. I often share content, racial justice content in my personal account. One, because it's important for me to speak up. It's important I understand my role as someone who is doing this work and speaking up and sharing educational resources and resources that I learn from, to the influence that I have. But also, too, I know that my family is religiously online, and I know that they see every single post, every single story. I know they see my social activities. So I am not only doing this for my commitment to racial justice and equity, I'm also doing this for them so that they get that influence, right? So for you, start also mapping out what those social media engagements are for your family members. What does that look like? How often are they online? What platforms do they use, right? What followers can you recommend for them? How can you help shape their algorithm? This might be a bit this may work or not, but an example that I share, which is a little bit funny, is that I have a friend who subscribed her sister and her mom to racial justice newsletters. So they just started getting those newsletters. They haven't unsubscribed to this day because they just started reading them. I'm not sure if they know how to unsubscribe, but they just started engaging in those emails because my friend subscribed them to that work. So again, utilizing the platforms that we have and that we know our families love can really help start shaping those conversations even before they happen. And I cannot express this enough, but equipping ourselves with in-depth understanding of racial justice work and history in the long run is important. Because a lot of the conversations that we will be having with our family members are very specific topics, right? Many of the dialogues that we'll unpack later on, they're very they might be vague. They're a bit more derailers, types of conversations that may come up in these conversations. But oftentimes when we call in our family members, it would be about specific things that they say, about specific communities, about specific issues, whether it be anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. So it's important for us to really understand and immerse ourselves in the work, histories, and the resources that Black, Indigenous, and many other racialized communities have already been doing. That learning will never stop, because the more we learn, the more we can actually equip ourselves with proper educational responses to the misinformation or to the disinformation that our families are engaged in. Which brings me to the point of knowing how to engage in misinformation and disinformation, right? And this is also a plug in, and Lisa already talked about the work of Tayo, but a lot of, from my own experience engaging in this work with, not just with my own family members, but with other families and Filipino families, many of the preconceived notions that they already have about racial justice or about racism, negative preconceived notions come from misinformation and disinformation that they see in social media. As much as we can use social media to utilize that environment and learning for them, social media can also become a hinder. It can also become a barrier for many of our families who are susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. So understanding what are those influences, what are those, again, going through or checking out who are people follows. Are they bad actors? Are they accounts that spread a lot of misinformation or disinformation? And then sort of start identifying and understanding why do our families follow them, and how can we bring up the fact that it's not healthy for them to be following them. Right. All right. And lastly, be patient, be persistent, commit to creating change, and find allies within your family, which is sort of the summary of what we just talked about. Okay. Any questions, any thoughts, anything that resonates to folks? If folks are good, I don't think we're gonna go through all of this, but I will be sharing you all a copy of this full list. So I often have a list of, like, as I mentioned earlier, dialogues that we may encounter in these types of conversations, including comments or microaggressions. Microaggressions meaning this comments, they call them micro, but they really are not micro, but comments, those regular comments that we hear, small comments that we hear on a regular basis that really have underlying racist or discriminatory themes around them. So one of them is our comments like, do not go under the sun, you're gonna go dark, or your nose is so flat. So ensuing that we have insinuating that our noses are not good, or our dark skin is not good just because they're dark, or just because they're flat nose. Again, going back to the comment around colonialism and how it all shaped us. Okay. All right. We have some dialogues here that okay. Yeah, thanks, Toby. It really, yeah, people should read it. So we can plug it in the chat, but we do have our topic around, we've written an article around colorism in the Filipino community. So yeah, there are some of these dialogues that in red that I've shared in this list that I will be sharing with you all, in this resource guide that I will be sharing with you all after, including how to respond to this type of comments. I like the first one because it's very brief. It's also not something that attacks the person for saying it, but it also flips the narrative that we should be ashamed of our dark skin or our flat nose. So I often say, oh, I got my beautiful skin and nose from a beautiful family and I'm proud of it, right? So it sort of unpacks why do we not see ourselves as beautiful. There's a more academic response to this depending on who you're having these conversations with, but bringing up the fact that colonialism has helped shape the way we negatively see our own Filipino beauty might, it's an academic way, it's a bit more jargonic way to respond to this, but if this is something that you find helpful to responding to certain family members, it really unpacks that issue right off the bat. There's conversations around who am I to speak about this issue? Nothing will happen if I engage, right? If we start this whenever we start these conversations with family members, there's always that sense of resistance or not understanding the gravity of why we should be speaking up, right? So also allowing people to understand their power and their influence, right? Having people around you, virtually or not, who listen to your voice and opinion is enough to make a difference. Imagine you and Tita, Tito talking about these issues, and then Tita, Tito talking to my cousin about these issues. That's twice as many people that are now engaged, right? And then adding some humor in the end, talking about the power of chismis, but in the context of racial justice. There are also, I'm going to skip through some of them because there's quite a few in the list here. When we're talking about resistance and like sort of people being uncomfortable or starting to feel agitated, we might hear terms like ang gulo-gulo mo kausap, or it's hard to talk to you, right? And we see, and when we sense that that agitation or that sense of sort of dismissiveness, we can again step out, recognize when to step out and pause the conversation. But before doing so, it's important to also clarify first, or maybe ease their minds and ease their thoughts as to why do you think this is complicated, asking them if there's anything I can clarify. The second quote here is, I really appreciate this, and I learned this from my friend Ashley Caranto Morford. During this conversation, I want us to teach each other. You've taught me a lot during our relationship, and I would like to offer that gift back, right? So again, framing the conversation as if our family members also have the power in this, although they are the ones that we're trying to call in, they have the power and they need to recognize that they have the power to learn. And when they learn, they have the power to influence you, to influence those around them, and that further share that learning after. Let's see. Ooh, do not answer me back. Wag mo akong sasagutin. Right. I think I want to unpack this because we got a comment earlier, we got a reflection earlier around Padlet and the Padlet around hierarchical ways, right? Hierarchical relationship with our families. We probably often hear this phrase that do not answer back to me or wag mo ko sasagutin from our parents who again are having that same mindset. And with that, there is this phrase, there's this response that we came up with, including, I want to enter this conversation with you in a good way and with genuine intentions. If you are not ready to engage in this conversation right now, that's okay, but I hope we can return to this conversation soon because it is important to me and the entire Filipino community. So again, that agitation, that piece of discomfort and people starting to feel that panic, right? You see from the last two comments that we have here, there's that people are probably in the panic zone already. So assessing when it's best to step away from the conversation is important. While again, recognizing that many of these phrases that are coming out from our families, they come out of that panic zone. They come out of that discomfort that they're feeling. And maybe because we live in a society where we are not taught to have proper conversations about our emotions, or we are not taught, we did not grow up in families where we have open conversations about vulnerability, about critical conversations about race. This is how we respond when we start feeling uncomfortable. And then I'll do one more. This is a good one. Diyos na lang ang bahala. Let God deal with it. I often hear this from my grandma. And so I went through the Bible and checked the Bible, and there are actually Bible verses that responds to that, including Proverbs 31:8-9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Okay. Before we close up, I think we're almost time. And this is just going to be sort of more of an open conversation at this point. You can share your thoughts in the chat, or you can unmute yourself at any time. Now that we've gone through sort of all of those dialogues, sample dialogues, and so those tactics that I've just shared, is there anything that I want to add here? Is there anything that you would like to add? So what are some strategies that you find useful? And then what are other pieces that are difficult about having racial dialogues with family members that either I already mentioned or maybe I haven't mentioned yet? Okay, let's see Toby here. Topic of race didn't really exist for my parents who grew up in the Philippines, so it was never really discussed here in the US where I was raised. Yeah, again, like having that's a really good point, Toby, because you brought up the fact that if they didn't really learn this growing up, or even in a country such as Philippines where the conversations of oppression is very much different. The racial hierarchy is very much different versus here in versus in America or in North America. It might even you might want to have that lens of, okay, how do I bring up these conversations to begin with? How do I create a grounding space? How do I create a foundational conversation with my parents, with Filipino families, if they've never had this conversation before? Right? So again, that goes back to my point around transparency, speaking to why it's important for you to have this conversation with them. I think that can really lead to a lot of conversations in itself. I'm sorry. And also, like the tactic around bringing them to spaces, it might also be uncomfortable for you to bring them in spaces that speaks about racial justice. But again, the more exposure that we have with our family members, in this similar spaces of racial justice, the easier it is for us to bring up those conversations again. Anything else? I see here from Gia, being an adult talking to adults make it easier to simply say we are all alike, we're all humans. It would have been difficult if I was a child. Yes, you were sort of expected to listen, be quiet as children, but never really told to do so. We were simply watching, listening, and learning that way. Yeah, I guess that was simply cultural. That was a really good point, Dia. Um, Around how we are expected to just listen and be quiet. And then what's that often what I've been often told, what kang sasabat, or like do not engage in these conversations, do not jump in these conversations because it's not your place as a child. Yeah, right. That's what our roles are. Like Kia said, it's expected, and it makes it even harder to think about it in the hierarchical sense that folks have brought up earlier. Because how do you bring up these conversations to family members who think that you're still their child and you shouldn't be bringing up these types of conversations to begin with to them? Because in the hierarchy of your family, they go above you and you should be listening to them. Right. And I hope those pieces around the conversations that we've had earlier around bringing up reciprocal learning and the importance of why you're bringing this up to them, and also being transparent to the fact that you don't know everything about this, that you are just simply inviting them to learn with you. Hopefully that sort of even out the playing field in a way that we're both equal in this journey. You may be learning from me, but I am just learning from you as well. It hopefully brings that, again, that trigger down, hopefully brings them a little bit lower into that comfort zone and learning zone, hopefully brings them lower to that learning zone instead of that panic zone. And then again, I just want to mention, it's a colonial way of thinking, right? The binary that one of you mentioned earlier, that binary of just black and white and nothing in between, that's colonial way of thinking, as mentioned, unpacked by dismantlingrace.org. Hierarchical ways of engaging with each other is colonial way of thinking. There's a lot for us to unpack and unlearn that colonialism have really brought us. Alex, from your experience, how many conversations did it take with them for them to start to see why these topics are important to discuss? Good question. It varies with people. It varies. If I'm gonna go through my family members right now, it really varies. For my brother, it varies where they are in the spectrum. My brother is very apolitical. He's not as progressive, but also he doesn't believe in like conservative ways of thinking. Is really just he doesn't want to care. But I notice that when I'm having these types of conversations with him, when he starts to realize that it matters to me, he starts engaging the conversation too. He makes an effort. But with my mom, it took me a long time. I'm not gonna lie. It took me probably and even now, there's still a lot of conflicts, a lot of dissatisfaction between the two of us, and not just her, but also me. I still feel my triggers when engaging in these types of conversations with her, and I cannot say that she's fully there, but she's much better off than when I first started calling her in and having these conversations with her. I would notice things like uh, she's not when I have these conversations with her, she's a bit more open now when I bring up the conversation, whereas before you can already tell that she's already agitated and uncomfortable, but now she's a bit more open. She can last conversations for like 30 minutes or so, whereas before it would take just 2 minutes and she'd shut me down, right? It could really depend on the journey of the person and your relationship with them. And it's not always easy. For some people, it might take much smoother process, much faster, but for others, it might take much longer. But the fact that they are better off than they were when you first had that conversation, I think that should be considered a win. That's something that you should be really proud of. Yeah. I hope that answers your question, Alex. I know it's not like a concrete number. All right. Anything else? Okay, thanks. Checking the time here. We have 2 minutes. Any other last thoughts? Anything else that folks want to bring up? I will share this reflections as well to you all. Lastly, I know I just asked you if there's anything else, but I just want to share this again and then we'll pause for a bit. It's important to also ask yourselves the hard questions, not just engage others in hard questions and hard conversations, because as I mentioned earlier, this work is lifelong. Where we're all flawed in a way that colonialism have had huge impacts on our being and the way we think and the way we live our lives. So it's important to have these reflections on an ongoing basis. And I credit Hey Berna for bringing up a lot of this and in her content. Okay. Any last thoughts? Maraming salamat. Any other questions? Anything else that folks want to share before we close off? We're at 9:59 Eastern Time. Thank you, folks. Yeah. Thanks, Gia. Thanks, Cecile. Okay, I'm glad. You'll be hearing from me after a couple of days from now. I'll share all of these resources, all of the dialogues that I shared, and the sources, citations that I've used. Okay, thanks, Joel. Thanks so much, everyone. I know we're such a small group today, but I'm really glad that folks were able to share through the Padlet and in the chat. I really appreciate everyone's vulnerability. Okay. Enjoy the rest of your evening. If there's anything else you'll hear from me, so you can reply in that email and follow up for more conversations like this. Take care, everyone.